Hello and welcome back. I'm Josh and I'm here to talk about 5 things that you can do to take your phone footage from sad to cinematic, so stick around. Hey guys, glad to have you here. If you're new to this channel, consider hitting subscribe and ring that bell to stay notified. I'm here to talk about all things art, and that includes filmmaking, photography, graphic design, painting, and so much more. Today, we're talking about 5 little tricks, hacks, whatever you want to call them, that are going to help improve your filmmaking. While a few of these things apply to filmmaking in general, no matter what you're filming with, all of these things are drastically going to improve your phone footage. So let's begin. This first thing should go without saying, and if you're watching this video, this is probably already a no-brainer. But the easiest thing you can do to not look like an amateur is this. Just take your phone and turn it sideways. I realize that seems simple. It's not really earth-shattering news for most of you, but I promise you, people still do this. I've worked on projects where I've had to request footage from people when I wasn't able to film something myself, and they've sent me vertical video. While not impossible, it's extremely difficult to make footage that looks like this look cinematic. So do yourself a favor and just turn your phone on its side and your footage is going to look so much better right off the bat. There are a lot of advantages to shooting with a phone, and we're going to talk about a few of those coming up, but there are also some disadvantages. You have to remember that you're shooting with a device with an incredibly small sensor size compared to DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. This introduces a lot of noise into your footage, especially in low light situations. An easy way to fix this is to add light, but you have to be careful because too much light can look just as bad. Blown out highlights and washed out flat images look just as cheap and low quality as noisy footage. For a really cinematic look, you need to balance your highlights and your shadows. The easiest way to do this is to add a soft, diffused directional light. Now you can buy video lights for this, but if money's tight, the best thing you can do is just use a window. Windows are great sources of light. They're soft, they're already diffused, they're directional, and they cost you nothing. Expose for the brightest parts of your image because if you have to lose one, it's better to crush your shadows than to blow out your highlights. And be sure to lock down your exposure as well, because the last thing you want is for your brightness to be shifting while you're filming. Another little bonus tip is to include reflective surfaces in your image to really catch those highlights. This is going to add a little punch to your video and really spice things up. In filmmaking, it's important to direct your audience's eyes to what they should be looking at within your frame. The easiest way to do this is through contrast. One of the reasons that DSLR filmmaking has become so popular over the last decade is the ability of those cameras to create a smooth, buttery, shallow depth of field, or what the professionals refer to as bokeh. By popping on a really fast like f1.4 lens and shooting wide open, you can really just melt away distracting backgrounds, and this easily sets your subject apart as the focal point. What you're doing essentially is creating contrast between the in and out of focus areas of your frame. When shooting with a phone, this isn't always as easy. You're gonna have to be creative because when you're shooting your wide shots, you're gonna have to find other ways to create contrast. Now you can do this through contrast of color, contrast of lighting, contrast of scale, but you have to be cognizant of your overall composition because it's not as easy to just blur out the background and make all the distracting things go away. That doesn't mean, however, that you can't create shallow depth of field with a phone. There are 3 different things that affect depth of field. The first of those is aperture, and that's something you don't really have a lot of control over with a phone. You're sort of stuck with what you have. With a DSLR, you can pop on a fast lens and you're good to go, but you're stuck with what you have with your phone. Focal length is the other thing that affects depth of field, and that's also something you have very limited control over with your phone. The third factor, however, is something you can take advantage of, and that's the distance between your subject and the camera. The closer you are to your subject, the shallower the depth of field. This is something that's really easy to achieve if you use an app to unlock the manual features of your phone. Simply set your focal point to the shallowest point and then move into your subject until you achieve focus. The closer you are, the shallower the depth of field. For this reason, when I'm shooting with a phone, I like to include a lot of close-ups and try to get as close to the subject as I can as often as possible. Now this limits your shot variety, but it will create far more cinematic images. There is one other method, and this definitely falls under the category of hack. As you know, you can create a fake shallow depth of field using portrait mode on your phone. Now, so far this technology is only available for still images, but if you're willing to make some sacrifices, there is a way to get around that. The first thing you have to do is go into your settings, scroll down to your camera, and turn off your grid. You also want to make sure you are shooting with 4K if possible. Next, you need to go to your camera and make sure you're in portrait mode. Now all you have to do is make a screen recording. Keep in mind that when you do this, you'll have to crop into your video pretty significantly to remove the controls around the edge. You also can't record audio when using this method, so you'll need to have an external recording device if that's something you need. This effect is pretty finicky too, so a lot of movement may throw this off. However, if audio isn't important and your subject is fairly static, this is a way that you could potentially fake shallow depth of field in a pinch. What makes video different than still photography is obviously movement. Now you can break movement down into two categories, camera movement and subject movement. On one end of the spectrum, you have very minimal movement. You can have a lockdown shot of someone sitting still talking to the camera like what I'm doing now, where the camera isn't moving at all and the subject is moving very slightly. On the other extreme, you have dynamic camera movements with intense action. Now, we're shooting with a phone, so we're probably not going to have any sweeping aerial shots or giant crane shots or huge movements like that, but that doesn't mean that you can't infuse your footage with dynamic movement. The first thing to focus on is camera movement. By tilting, panning, pushing in and out, these things are going to add life to your shots. Keep in mind, you do not have to do all of these camera movements in camera. You can also create fake movement in editing. Using keyframes in Adobe Premiere or your editor of choice, you can artificially push into your shot by increasing the scale. You can pan from side to side or even add a slight rotation. You're going to need to crop into your image a little when you do this, so make sure you shoot a little bit wider than you need and at as high a resolution as possible. When you couple motion with subject action though, things really start to get cinematic. Think about what you can move within your frame and how you can pair your camera movements with that to create dynamic action. Also, look for things you can put in the foreground because this is going to add depth and really enhance your camera moves. Now this is good for getting dynamic shots, but what about dynamic sequences? We have to think about the movement of our audience's eyes within the frame and how this is going to change from one shot to the next. If the action is leading our viewer's eyes in one direction, we want to continue that motion into the next shot. The last thing you want to do is make your viewer's eyes jump around a lot from frame to frame. So when you're filming with a phone, think ahead about what kind of movement you're creating. How is your subject moving? How are you moving your camera? And how can you use that movement to connect one shot to the next? With all that movement going on, you're going to need to stabilize your image. Now you can use a gimbal or something like that if you have the money, but what if you're only using your phone and you don't have any additional gear? Phones are small and light and subject to jitter. It also doesn't help that the camera's on the corner and not the center. This amplifies shake. The first thing you need to do is check to see if your phone has any built-in stabilization. This is really easy to do if you're using a phone app, which I highly suggest you do, but make sure that that's turned on first and foremost. Secondly, make sure you're holding your phone with two hands and keep it really tight to your body. When you're creating movement, you don't want to have your arms out at a distance. You want to keep the phone tight and you want to move your entire body with the phone. This is going to create smooth motion and it's going to eliminate shake from arm fatigue. Another way to smooth out your footage is to shoot in slow motion. Now this is the primary reason that I use my phone for filmmaking because I can shoot all the way up to 240 FPS in 1080p. Now 240 is almost too slow, so most of the time I actually shoot in 120 FPS. When you play that back in 24 frames per second, you've slowed your footage down 5 times, and this really smooths out any additional shake. The last thing to remember is that you can always use image stabilizer to really just iron out any last little jitter that's showing up. And if you want to speed ramp your footage afterwards, just stabilize it first, nest your sequence, and then apply any of your speed adjustments to your nest so you'll have no problems whatsoever. For best results, use all of these options together and you should end up with some hyper smooth cinematic footage. Well guys, that's been my 5 tips on how to improve your phone footage. I hope it helped. If you've used any of these in the past, or if you know of other ways that you can help improve your phone footage, leave me a comment. And as always, stay creative.